Ukraine is executing a comprehensive strategy, and it's one that is breaking Russia's ability to wage war. But more than that, it is putting into jeopardy the entire Putin regime. The strategy is both unified and effective. The military strikes are disabling ships, they are hitting depots, and they are destroying command nodes across Russia. Meanwhile, the economic strikes are taking out the refineries, hitting the ports, and destroying the rail that fund the war. We see the information attacks are now exposing the lies of the Kremlin and the electronic warfare that is blinding Russia's defenses. The goal here is quite simple and it's clearly brutal. Make Russia unable to move fuel, make it impossible to make money, and make it impossible to execute orders. It's time to force choices between the home front and the front in this war. Turn every repair into a delay. Turn every delay into a defeat. Russia can ultimately fire missiles, but it cannot fire rubles. And that's why every port delay makes the budget collapse come sooner than before. And all of these things are creating greater gaps in Russia. Gaps in the infrastructure, gaps in the economy, and gaps in the military. And this chain of events, they all work together. A refinery burns, a pier slows, a budget bleeds, and ultimately, the battlefield, it obeys the balance sheet. My name is Jason Smart. I'm a special correspondent for the Kiev Post, and I'm a national security advisor. What we're seeing inside of Russia is nothing short of incredible. We're seeing that these deep strikes are creating significant budget pain. We see the refineries, them being attacked, is going to cut the amount of diesel and jet fuel across Russia. This all creates more pain for Russia's military. The ports slowing down are causing the tankers to wait. This means there's less cash in the economy. The export bans, without the export of goods, Russia doesn't have hard currency. It doesn't have dollars or euros. Without that, Russia is in a very difficult situation. But the best part is that all of these things are just individual dominoes. They all work together to fall in just one direction. It's the direction of the fuel shortages causing problems at the piers, and those problems at the piers causing problems in the budget. And all of this comes back to damaging Russia's ability to wage war on the battlefield. So let's look at what this means. Let's look at how all of this fits together. And you'll see very clearly that today, Russia's ledger is got a lot of red ink because there's nothing good going on. There are only problems. We see that the units at the front, they're stuck with these huge operational pauses, waiting longer, and all the while, losses are mounting. Because so far we've seen that September has proven to be a catastrophic month for Russia. Incredibly enough, though, the Western press never discusses this. The Western press pretends as if Russia is a superpower waging war that has a chance of winning. The fact is, Russia cannot win unless we allow it to. And what Ukraine is doing today is truly putting the Kremlin on a back foot. It is going to be harder and harder for the Kremlin to continue waging war. And this is something that Vladimir Putin worries about. This is something that concerns him. Because it's one thing we're talking about a hypothetical threat, or we're talking about a loss far away in Ukraine. But when you're talking about something that destabilizes his regime, something that could very well cause turbulence within his fiefdom, that's not something he wants to hear about. That's not something that he thinks is good. He likes to hear that all is well, not that Russia is losing. Just look at this month alone. A $60 million warship was crippled. The Black Sea Fleet's communications hub, it was hit 300 kilometers, that's 180 miles, from Ukraine. Guess what? The Baltic export hub, the one that Russia needs so desperately to gain cash, about $15 billion a year that typically goes through it, that began to choke. So one thing relates to the other. One effect across fuel, exports, and command. And this means that it affects all of Russia. Russian civilians are also feeling this. Russians across Russia see this because it relates directly to them. Think about this. When distillation stops, diesel and jet fuel fall everywhere in Russia. It's not limited to the military. That means that families see higher prices. That also does mean that the units face greater shortages. And all these deep attacks by Ukraine hitting the refineries, such as the one at Kershi, That's about 800 kilometers, 500 miles from Ukraine. The other one in Novorossiysk, that's 1,400 kilometers, 870 miles. Both of those hubs are critical for Russia. Without that, with the scarcity of parts, it is going to be impossible for Russia to get it back on track. It's impossible for Russia to keep up the volumes which it needs. This will all trickle down. This will affect the Russian economy, the Russian civilians, the Russian military, and eventually the Russian government leadership. This is a government leadership that's facing other losses. Look at the attack in Primorsk, the one near St. Petersburg. That handles about 60 million tons per year of oil. That's roughly 1 million barrels per day. That is feeding the shadow fleets. That's specifically what Russia needs today in order to finance this war. Without the ability to export oil, what does Russia have? Just think yourself. What does Russia produce outside of oil? It doesn't produce a lot of other goods. Outside of vodka, very few people can think of something that comes from Russia that people buy. So if Russia cannot export its oil, what does Russia have? What fallback plan can it offer? It does not have a fallback plan. It has a total disaster. So despite what the press says, things are not going well for Russia, which is exactly why today we should be backing Ukraine. Ukraine can win this war. It's up to us to help them do it. Help me get this truth to more people of what's going on in Ukraine and what's really happening inside of Russia. You can do it. Just like this video, subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member today. But let's go back to this. Let's look at exactly what is going on, why it's so bad, and why for Russia, things are simply out of control. Consider this. The multiple strikes that Ukraine has carried out across Russia, the one in Novorossiysk, for instance, that's not something they're going to be able to fix quickly. Like the attack on the Black Sea Fleet's communications hub, that's something that Russia lacks the parts to fix. It doesn't have a ton of modern technology. It doesn't have microchips. It's very reliant on the West. And though Russia, of course, is able to violate sanctions, and it does, that's much harder when you have a specialized part you need. Specialized goods, such as the ones that the military needs. These sorts of parts, these technologies, they're not common. They're easy to track. And so if Russia cannot get access to them, it means they'll just have to do without. Things like air defense or doing without refineries is something that Russia cannot do. That's not an option. There is no way for Russia to continue a war like this. So with all this combined, Russia is putting itself in a worse situation, but it has no way out. Vladimir Putin increasingly is divorced from the reality. It seems very clear that he speaks to a very small group of advisors and to nobody else. And when he speaks to a small group of advisors, do you think that they tell him how bad the situation is? Or do you think they tell him what he wants to hear? He wants to hear that things are fine. He wants to hear that Russia is winning. And that's why it's very clear in the negotiations, including those with the United States, he doesn't seem to really understand what is happening inside of Ukraine. It seems increasingly clear that he believes a lot of nonsense. He believes that Russia currently occupies much broader swaths of Ukraine than it really does. So why does he believe that? Well, if you're surrounding Putin and you're making millions of dollars a year illegally embezzled from the military, this war is economically beneficial to you. You want to see it continue. And so you have to tell him there's results, there's progress, and this is why Russia should continue fighting. So he believes that they've done just fine. But all of the data shows something quite a bit different. In fact, just the summer offensive, which totally failed, had over 210,000 casualties. That's phenomenal. 210,000 men killed or injured to gain nothing. Not one large city, not one large town. Nothing. In no way did it bring Russia closer to victory. So when considering this, what does it all mean though? Why is this important? Well, simply because of this. These attacks that Ukraine is carrying out are pretty important because it's going after the stability of the Putin regime. By attacking the very systems that generate revenue for Russia and attacking its military capacity or even the ability to create military capacity and to attack the entire economy of Russia, this puts the Putin regime in a very difficult position. This is a position for which they have no solution, a position for which they never anticipated having to respond to. And one of the things that's helping make that a reality are drone strikes. And that's why I have a brief message for those who didn't see it yesterday from the soldiers of Rubesh, who we have donated drones to. And they want to thank you themselves for your great generosity.
Hi, Jason J. Smart and your YouTube community. This is a message from the soldiers of the Rubesh Brigade fighting in the Pokrovsk direction. We have just finalized of the United Unmanned Systems the delivery of 200 drones for them, and partly they have been funded by your donations, and it was a huge part of this delivery. Thank you so much.
Again, thank you everybody who's donated. In fact, this flag behind me here is from Rubesh. They sincerely thank you for the life-saving drones. And anybody interested in donating can see the first comment below, which I'll pin, which has both the PayPal and bank transfer information for those wishing to help Ukraine get more life-saving drones. So let's go back to this. Why is this so important, and why is the Putin regime now so worried? Well, it's very simple. Now, imagine you're one of the oligarchs who realizes that things are not going well. You realize that Putin is being lied to. And you like Putin, but more importantly, he helps you make a lot of money. For many years, he allowed you to become an oligarch. You have a motive, though, if your businesses are losing money, to tell him things aren't going well. Sure, you could justify to him that you support the war. You're totally on board. But you know, Vladimir, across Russia, our refineries are burning. Our companies are losing money. And that's putting us on a very bad situation. This situation is becoming untenable. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin, you have a choice. You can listen to the soothsayers and those who tell you everything's fine. But you know you're running a risk. Because if this war continues to expand, it continues to expand across Russia, you know your own regime is being challenged. But there's something else. You know that the oligarchs are beginning to fight. And this tension is beginning to boil over because there's some who are gaining from this war. They want to make money. And as I've mentioned before, the logic of Russia is so jaded that there are undoubtedly some who are happy to see that there's 210,000 casualties. For instance, this summer offensive, though we all consider it to be a failure, if you work in the industry of funerals, one of the fastest growing industries in Russia, you might view this as a positive. It's great for business. Or if you make uniforms, sure, you got to sell a lot of uniforms. But what happens to soldiers thereafter? Do you really care? Their life has no more utility to you than simply they wore the uniform one time. And that's exactly how the Russian oligarchy thinks. That's their psychology. That's their real behavior. So if you're an oligarch who's losing money and you're looking at this, you realize this is a good time perhaps to strike a relationship with the military. The Russian military has had 16 generals arrested since 2022. So if you happen to know people in the Russian military, generals, for instance, who don't want to go to prison, and you know generals who don't want to die in the war, this might be a good time to talk about them, to talk with them about the fact that there are some in the oligarchy who are costing Russian soldiers' lives. There are some there profiting from this war, and some of those people are associated with the FSB, the grand foe of the military. These oligarchs all have their own interests, and if we want to understand Russia, we should understand this. There is nobody at the senior elites, if it's the FSB or the military or the oligarchs, that are doing what is best for Russia. Every last one is doing what is best for them. So these conflicting interests, these different entities, the FSB, the military, the oligarchs, they are already fighting with each other. And these attacks by Ukraine are making the situation more and more unstable within Russia. Ultimately, Russia doesn't have a solution. And the good part is, there is no way for them to create a solution. There is a big problem here. And what we see is pretty clear. Russia is losing the war. The Kremlin is facing pressures it can no longer pay to contain. The only question left at this point is this. What will break first? The army, the budget, or the regime? Because today, there are oligarchs in Moscow that do not want to see this regime continue to exist. Thank you for watching. Please like this video, please subscribe to this channel, and consider becoming a channel member. But below, please leave me your comments. What's going to happen first? The army, the budget, or the regime? Or do you think we will see a revolt or a coup in the Kremlin? As always, thank you for supporting Ukraine.